All right, so now we'll add a drop shadow to this, but we're gonna also keep in mind our initial diagram, basically. So remember we had a horizon line that was somewhere through there. This won't be entirely straight, so forgive me for that. And we had a light source that would go up from there, be somewhere up here. And from there, we could use perspective to find a approximation. Probably not even, I don't even know if approximation would be the right word, because if you do this correctly, it's going to be, where it is. Perspective is exactly how a light source will work within the scene. So if we go like this, you see that based on where we're at, we get a very large shadow. So our ground plane is going to sit, somewhere like that. Now I feel like that shadow is way too elongated, but then again, I started with the light source that's probably a lot shorter within a scene. For if this was a large sphere in like a street or something like that, or a park, then it's gonna probably wouldn't be in a street, right? And we'll say in a park, then it's probably going to have the light source a lot higher up. But the sun can be setting; it's coming down. As that happens, the shadow is going to elongate. But the other thing to think about is that the shadow isn't necessarily going to be, definitely isn't going to be as solid. So as it comes this way, it's going to dissipate, it's going to fade off. So even if we do decide to do this kind of large drop shadow, we also want to think about how this might blend off to the edges, to the distance away from the light source, things like that. So what we're going to do is just kind of imagine this. I wanted you to at least understand the principles. So again, that would be if we were developing a scene and everything was relating back to the initial perspective. In this case, I actually want to just kind of imagine the way this shadow will look. So I'm just going to draw this out, or kind of a base shape. So I'm just thinking about this cast shadow of this sphere. And we'll say something like that. And I want to round this out. So this is basically just an ellipse. And this is just our container. This is just a perimeter shape to get us started. Now I could have just generated a ellipse just like I did with the sphere, the circle from the start. But I think it's good to always challenge yourself and try to draw things, even though I didn't draw the circle. But so just straightening that out a bit so it looks a little bit more like it's attached to a ground plane. So now with this, I'm just going to tone this back a little bit. And I'm going to add another layer over top. And so now what I want to think about is, what are the darkest points that I want to see in this? Now, generally, the way it's going to happen is you're going to have this darker shadow closer to the object. So, we have to perceive that the light is pushing that shadow, and it's very apparent closer to the object. But then as it works its way out here, it's going to fade off. So let's just start right here. And I'm going to purposely start with some heavier lines. And I'm also going to bring these in either tighter or heavier as they get closer to the object. Either one will convey a darker shadow. So just this is where you play around with these concepts. You start to, you get good with developing your lines relatively straight. So you start to play around with line weight and intensity. We'll talk more about tapering lines. I'm getting some taper here, but it's really just me trying to implement pressure more than the taper. It's just kind of the way this particular brush works. You're generally going to get more of a taper. So this is going to be, your results will vary based upon what you're using. If you're using a micron pen or if you're using a different software, they all vary, right? So now we've got a little bit darker effect, and I really feel like closer to this, I want it to be even darker. Now, one of the reasons I'm purposely using heavier line weight, for one, it is faster for me to get the value that I want, the darker value, but also it helps to not conflict with the lines that I have in the sphere. So you just have to be aware of that sometimes you make the lines different just to convey your depth and your your various materials more effectively. So now we've got a little bit of our starting point for the darker area there. So now what I want to do is actually go right through this entire area, and I'll go with a little bit lighter line. Remember, speed will generally help you get a cleaner line, and we can always go back and clean up the edges, but I'm using this container that I drew out just to kind of keep me on point here. Keep in mind too, I'm also a distance away from my canvas where it's easy for me to pull this while resting my hand on the screen. So again, thinking about the mechanics and the way that you create can be very important. I actually should have just went straight up and down with these to keep the lines less conflicting. So just like that, we have our next little bit of tone. And we could almost probably do away with this now, but I'm going to keep it a little bit longer. So now I want to bring some lines in the opposite direction. Still relatively light though, but I'm going to pass through everything else. So again, I'm thinking about darkening everything at once. I don't want to just kind of stop. And if I do stop, I actually stopped a little bit through the middle here. I need to pick back up over here so that I keep this kind of uniform shading going on as I pass through certain areas. Again, it's not real pretty, it's not real pristine or anything like that. Let go of any concept of perfection, but I am trying to keep a little bit of thought process into this as I keep darkening this. So now I feel like this shadow needs to still be darker, and I feel like it needs to shade to about here. I actually want it to be a little bit darker all the way to about right there, and I also want to curve it as I do that. So I'm going to think about a shape like that. I'm going to pick another angle. I need to try to round that out a bit. And I'm also going to press a little bit harder because I really want to darken this area up, so I can press harder, and I can also bring those together. You see it's getting pretty messy there, but that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. And I could even fade that off. I could go past that edge if I want to soften up that. Now I can soften up my edges. There's lots of things I could do. I actually want a little bit more of a crisp edge to this. But the other thing to think about is after you get this, I'm just going to kind of throw in some random lines here and kind of sculpt the sides of this. And I want this bottom right under the sphere to be really dark. So I'm actually just pushing some more lines from the middle out. Just like that. So starting from the darkest point and fading out. Okay, so now I've got the shading that I want here. And I'm going to get rid of that initial line from the base. Double click this so it straightens it out and pan back. And you see now we've got, a pretty decent shadow there. So the other thing to think about is I can also go back to this now and say that these lines here are a little too solid for me. I can come back in the other direction with the translucent brush, and I can fade that out as well. So it starts off, the lines are a bit tighter in succession, and then I fade those out as I go into the area that I want to retain that dark area. And I can do this all throughout the design. So I can go back to the sphere. Let's go ahead and merge these together. And I could do that through here. Say these lines are a bit too abrupt for me. Let's actually make this a bit larger so you can see it better. And I can really break these up. So, really take advantage of everything that you can do. I could go back here. I could use this to incorporate some bounce light. So if I wanted to put a highlight on the bottom of this, because we got to remember the light can hit off the ground plane and it can bounce back up. That's what gives us reflected light or bounce light. I'm not going to do that in this example, but I just want you to think about all these things. And then the other thing that's going to make, actually let me show you one more thing with the translucent. I don't like how this line is so solid, mainly because it was computer generated. I really should have drew that in, but you can also erase this back. And again, you can have a more solid area, and as it goes around this way, they get wider. And you can generally convey light source that way by thinning up the line weight to the side with the light source. So just, again, keep that in mind. And then lastly, you could really make this look more dimensional by adding some atmospheric effects. So we know that our horizon line was something like this. And we could say that, you know, maybe there's some tone back here. However we want to implement that. You know, whether or not you hatch it or cross hatch it or stipple it or texture it, whatever you want to do, just to, again, think about the value and the shift. And look how just that little bit makes that a lot more dimensional. So that's the basics of what we're going to be discussing and implementing into the scene creation, but I wanted to give you some ways to practice. And think of this like you should always practice with primitives anyways. Spheres, pyramids, rectangular shapes, everything that you draw breaks down into these primitive shapes in one way or another. Yes, it seems boring sometimes and like, well, I'm just, you know, maybe I'm a lot better artist than that. I don't need that. You will always need that. So always, if you ever find yourself doodling on the page and not knowing what to do and how to improve, get back to the basics, try some of these practice activities, and it's always a good thing. So let's wrap up right here and head over to our next lesson.